ahead and begin. Gentlemen, Steve, when he's finished with his question, push into him for listening, and then stay there. Okay, anytime.
Anytime? Okay. John Chancellor, it's wonderful to see you.
It's good to see you, Dan.
And I want to congratulate you for being one of the personalities of the American media, all times, that been awarded for bringing the Middle East peace process to the education and to the knowledge of the American people. And we're talking about some years.
We're talking about many years, and I remember how small it all looked and how hopeless it all looked back at the beginning of the process 20 years ago. I remember so many memories about Israel. It's been thrilling, up and down, despair, hope, and it's still going on. But my feeling is now that the peace process is irreversible, that it's going to happen.
I remember you, John, coming to Israel quite a few times during these last 20 years, and we witnessed a lot of efforts on the part of the American diplomacy. There was the Henry Kissinger shuttle diplomacy in the 70s, and then came the Sadat visit in 1977, and here you come with President Sadat going off his plane and witnessing the very dramatic meeting with him and Mr. Begin and all the Israeli leadership. What did you feel at that time?
I felt that I had grown up in the United States, which is an intensely political country, and that until the Sadat visit to Israel, I had never really seen politics played as politics really should be played. He was brilliant. Golda Meir was brilliant. Begin was brilliant. They all played their roles with, they should have got Academy Awards.
You know, there was a joke saying when Golda Meir had later on, it was a year or two later, that Mr. Sadat and Mr. Begin were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She said sarcastically and jokingly said, "Nobel Peace Prize? I thought they're going to get the Oscar."
She was a wonderful jokester. Golda Meir could pull jokes right out of the middle of the air. She was arguing with Henry Kissinger at one point, and in exasperation, he said, "Madam Prime Minister, I'm an American official, an American citizen, and a Jew in that order. And you've always got to remember that order of me." And she said, "Yes, but Henry, in Israel we write from right to left."
John, you've met many, I imagine, or interviewed Sadat during the years of you with NBC. What kind of an impression did you get from him at that time?
I got an impression of growth. When I first met Sadat, he spoke military English fairly well, but he couldn't really discuss philosophy or politics or anything. I saw him in a few years grow into a man who could discuss these things, who was self-taught. And it wasn't just English, it was that his mind expanded. You could see that he was thinking on a larger scale. And growth is the one highest respect I have for him. I saw him change and grow and become a real statesman from a soldier.
When you were on board of his plane, flying from, I think it was Ismailia to Tel Aviv on the 19th of November 1977, it was a short trip, but I imagine you had a chance to exchange few words with him. What was the focal point at this short trip just prior to his historic landing in Israel?
Sadat was very poised, but he was also very nervous. He didn't know what might expect him in Israel. He didn't know what the reaction of the people would be. He depended very heavily on adulation from crowds. he worried, at least he tried to hide it, but I could tell that he was worried and nervous about what kind of reception he would get. And after all, he was seeing Begin, who was his enemy in the world at that time. And I think he had stage fright.
But he overcame it.
He overcame it with some of the most beautiful. I worked for Lyndon Johnson as a president here in the United States, and I never saw Lyndon Johnson as skilled as Sadat was with the members of the Knesset.
John, I remember about a year and a half later, in March 1969, you all came back with President Jimmy Carter to Jerusalem and Cairo. Actually, it was just a few days before the whole peace agreement was wrapped up. But there were moments of hesitation, moments of doubt. I think there was even a preliminary briefing on the American side as if the visit was a failure, and within one day it turned to be triumphant.
I remember that evening vividly, and I remember the role you played in it, because the Americans were telling us in the press that it had all fallen apart. And I called you in your hotel room or in your office, and you said, no, that's not true. And then I went up to Jody Powell, who was the press secretary of the White House, and I said, Jody, I just don't believe you. I have a very good friend in whom I have utter confidence. I didn't say Dan Pattir, who assures me that although it's been difficult, it's not off the tracks. And they insisted that in that official U.S. room that it was off the track. And of course, the next morning, it came on the track as though it had been planned.
That's correct.
And this was the President Carter, who ran for office saying, I'll never lie to you. So you grow up in Israel covering those politics.
As the same is probably in other countries too. Camp David was also some landmark on the road to peace. Here come the three leaders, seclude themselves for 2 weeks in Camp David, with a lot of bewilderment as something will come up. This was also the days when the Ayatollah Khomeini was already on a march in Tehran, and this country was a little bit also confused.
Mm-hmm.
Can you recall the mood in this country, or your own thinking at that time, whether the Middle East peace is reachable, is attainable, or there was a big doubt about it at that time?
I think there was a big doubt about it at that time, but then we were dealing with a different kind of President Carter. We were dealing with the good Carter rather than the duplicitous Carter. The Carter we were dealing with at Camp David was absolutely unshakable in his determination that something would have to come out of those meetings. And it wasn't just his domestic politics, it was his feeling that this was very important for the world. And he was sincere, and he worked very, very hard, and he bullied, and he did all of those things. But it came out a triumph. And again, that's one of the many ups and downs of our lives in Washington and in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem in connection with the peace process. I remember it was a rainy night, thunder and lightning, when the negotiators came down from Camp David to the White House to brief us. And the weather just didn't augur well. You thought there was going to be bad news, but it was good news.
That's true, I remember it very well. The one thing that intrigued me, and maybe you are the best judge to do it, how much the American public, the enlightened American public, was interested, was eager, or how much the media, yourself and your colleagues, were changing interest of the American public with regards to the Middle East?
I think every time the American public learned more about the Middle East, the peace process grew stronger. I think it was a long process of 20 years of education, of explaining Israel, of making Israel look like the democracy that it is, of legitimate news stories that showed that the democratic process in Israel moves not smoothly but up and down and back and forth like anybody's politics, like our own politics. I think that was a terribly important lesson for Americans to live with Israel, to see Israel develop and grow and mature over that period of years. Only a long time like that, Dan, could have built up the trust that the American people had in Israel, which they have today.
By the same token, one can say that the perception of the Arabs in the eyes of the Americans also changed for the better, didn't it?
I think it
with the peace
did.
process, I mean.
Although we've had some enormous setbacks. We had the taking of the hostages was the worst, and there was an underlying anti-Arab current in the United States that was very strong. And it worried me because the Arabs are, as you know, an entirely different set of peoples. They're very diverse. There are many different kinds. There are many different religions. And to put them all in one hateful basket, as we did during the hostage crisis, really set back the understanding that was necessary if we were to ever have a real relationship. And that scared me during that period. And the Arab oil boycotts were no help.
Remember, there were Americans who were kidnapped and abducted by terrorists as well. There were attacks on American embassies. This was a bad time. September 1970, American airliners were blown up in Jordan.
It was a very serious time. And that's when, and that caricature of the Arab still exists in the minds of some Americans. And it's an obstacle in the peace process.
John, would it be too much to ask you to recall some anecdotes, personal anecdotes vis-a-vis the Israeli leaders, Sadat, Carter, in the same context, as far as your experience was concerned?
Well, Begin was a wonderful, I liked Golda Meir because I liked her humor more than anything else. But Begin was a wonderful negotiator. I once went, he was in New York, and we were in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and we had arranged for a meeting with the Prime Minister. And all the executives from NBC came along. You may have been there.
Yeah, I remember that.
And in that big suite at the Waldorf Astoria. And Begin said to me, as we were just sitting down to get ready for the interview, he said, "How long is this interview?" And I said, "As long as we want it to be, Prime Minister." And he said, "No," he said, "I'm an old Jewish tailor. I know what you do with scissors."
And I always told me, don't get me into a taping session. I prefer to do it live. Why? He said, at least in a live broadcast, I know what I say, and I know how much is being carried on the air. If I tape it in advance, then I don't know what happens with it.
Yeah, but he wanted me not to be a journalist, but just a filmmaker at that point, and I wouldn't do it. And I said no. And we finally came to a compromise. But, and with Sadat, you remembered his vulnerability as a human being. Sadat was one of the most beautifully dressed men I ever knew in my life. But he was always fixing his necktie. He was always getting himself making sure that every hair was in place. Everything was perfect because he was, after all, a junior military officer who had been elevated to a very high position and who held the world in his hand.
True. If I may, I'll reciprocate with a story of mine. 2 days before Sadat arrived in Jerusalem, namely 17th of November, 77, he was in Ismailia. He came from Syria, where he was rejected by Assad. And then he called a press conference, about 300-400 people. And he was supposed to show in this press conference the letter of invitation he got from Mr. Begin to come to Jerusalem. So everything almost starts, and then he turns halfway, smiling, puffing his pipe, turns to Mubarak, his deputy at that time, and says, Hosni, please give me my letter from Mr. Begin. Hosni Mubarak turned pale and gray, and he said, Mr. President, I forgot it in Cairo. Sadat didn't stop laughing, smiling, smoking the pipe, and whispered to Mubarak, never mind, just give me a blank envelope. That was enough. And the whole documentation that showed Sadat in this press conference holding the invitation from Begin was a blank envelope.
He was a wonderful natural politician, Sadat. I once saw him in front of the Egyptian parliament in Cairo making a 2-hour speech. In the course of the speech, he first took off his necktie. He then took off his coat. He then took off his shirt. And he got down to the peroration on the script, on the speech, and he realized this was all ad lib, that he was going to have to pull himself together. And with the utmost grace, he dressed again and got his shirt on and his necktie tied perfectly and his coat on and bid them all farewell. There are so many memories of Israelis and some Palestinians and some Arabs, and the little shoots of friendship that you could see developing among them. And there was one restaurant I remember in Jerusalem that was started by a Jew and an Arab.
Called Dolphin restaurant.
And somebody rolled a grenade in the door. Sure. Right after it got started. And it broke everybody's heart.
Correct.
In the press because it was very good fish.
That's true. Good memory. Oh, looking back in a retrospective way as we do, and looking forward, what kind of vision do you see as far as the Middle East is concerned from your own experience?
The kind of vision that I see is that there is a process that is irreversible, that it's a long process, it isn't over, and it's hideously complicated, and it's mortal and very dangerous. But the fact is that it's inevitable. And the more I grow older and the more I look at what has happened in Israel and in the Middle East generally, and in Lebanon, and in Egypt, and now in Syria, and in Jordan, I begin to see the inevitability of this process. I can't tell you how many years. I don't know. And I can't tell you how much blood has to be shed before we reach the final point. But reach the final point will happen. I will go to my grave believing that. And I hope it happens before.
John, I'm very grateful for the interview, for the time you gave us, and for all your personal contribution through the American media and your own NBC with regards to enlightening the Americans about the Middle East.
All we did was tell your own wonderful story, Dan.
Thank you very much indeed. All the very best to you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Cut.
Very nice, gentlemen. If I may ask you just to
Intercuts.
retain your positions for a few moments, we'll just record some room tone and get some reaction shots of you listening to each other. If that's all right with you, it'll take about 1 minute.
What do you want to do? Just to change the cassette?
No, we want to record room tone
Yes.
and shoot a reaction shot.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Quiet for room tone, please.
Rolling.
Yes.
20 seconds of room tone, please.
And if you could just look at each other, please.
That's it.
And room tone.
Okay. Stop tape.